back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hey guys, so I am here today to do my second wrap up of the SPFBO, which stands for Self-Published Fantasy Blog-Off. This is an award that was set up by Mark Lawrence a couple years ago, and this is the third time that it's running, and I was selected as one of the bloggers or vloggers who are reading through the long list to try and come up with a shortlist and hopefully then judge of the shortlist which is the best. So basically how it works is that 300 books were submitted. It was on a first come first served basis, and as long as they fit the requirements, which was that they were the first book in a series, fantasy and self-published, then they were each given out to the 10 bloggers, myself included, in batches of 30. So I am reading 30 books and choosing one as my finalist. I've already done a wrap up of the first 5 that I read, and this is going to be the next 5 that I read. So go and check out that first one and then come back and watch this video as well. And let's get started. If you want to know more about the whole process and how it all works, I'll link you to Mark Lawrence's blog post about it all, and I've done a video where I talk about all 30 of the books I'm going to be reading as well, so I'll link that in the cards for you guys to go and watch. So let's get started talking about the next 5 on my long list. I didn't have as much success with this next 5. In fact, I actually DNF'd 3 of these 5. I only read 2 the whole way through. So I'm going to talk about the 3 that I DNF'd first, and then build up to the ones that I actually finished and the one that actually got a good rating from me, which won this round of my 5. The first one that I DNF'd, unfortunately, was The Pain of Compassion by Roland Boykin. Now, this book has a lovely cover, it seems very fantastical in theme, and it came across as a book that I might actually really enjoy, so I went into this quite hopeful. Unfortunately, I could tell fairly early on that it was very stereotypical, and that was what put me off. It didn't feel like it was that innovative. We follow a young character who is called Navon, and Navon is very early on chosen to become a magical being of some kind. He's got something in his blood that means he is different, and he has the blood of the Deluthi, which I think is the name of the actual series as well. It's called the Eye of Deluthi. It seems like we're following him, and he has this magical blood which has been long vanished from the world. People have kind of believed that these Deluthi have died out, but he has this magical power in his blood, and all his family except him seems to know about it. And he, at the beginning of the book, discovers that he's got it. And he has to move away from the place that he grew up to go and find more about this power that he possesses, and I guess discover his talents as he goes. So that's all fine, that's fairly stereotypical. My biggest problem with this book was that it felt really easy and quite predictable. And I don't really like books that are overly complicated, but I also don't like books that are really obvious, and I feel like this one was a bit too close to obvious. It didn't feel like the magic system was that developed, although I didn't get hugely far with the book. I think I made it to 35%, and that's where I DNF'd. But saying that, this book was around 500 pages, and 35% of that is almost 200 pages, so I read a fair chunk of it before DNFing. Just feel like I wanted more from this. I feel like the ideas and the potential is probably there. The writing was not bad. It was fast, it was action-packed, you kind of got into the action straight away, and there is a female character who comes quite early on into the plot as a kind of guiding influence for Navon, who could have been a very good character as the story went on. I personally don't know because I didn't go too far with it. But I feel like it tells a very predictable story. It falls into the trap, telling the reader things and not really just showing them and guiding them through the story. Instead of feeling like you're with the characters and you're guessing things as you go and you're discovering things with them and you're kind of part of the plot and you're in the world, it feels a lot more like you are observing the characters from far away and you already kind of know the answers to stuff. You already can figure things out that the characters aren't aware of. And I don't love that in a book. I kind of want to be surprised alongside the characters. I want to feel like even though I'm learning things, I'm not being given the entire plot straight away. And that's kind of how I felt with this one. So I did DNF it. I obviously don't know if it gets better as it goes on. I didn't rate it on Goodreads, but I think if I had continued with the book, my prediction would be it would only have got maybe a 2.5 or a 3. I don't think it would have got more than that. So I gave up on it because I felt like it wasn't going to be enough of a wow factor to beat the previous books that I read for the first batch of 5, if that makes sense. All of the previous books I read were really strong, So it was going to be hard to compete after that really initial great round that I had. I don't think it's a bad book. I'm sure that a lot of people would enjoy this, especially if you haven't read an awful lot of fantasy. If you're fairly new to the genre, it might be a good one to start off with because it is fast-paced and it is fun, but it does read slightly predictably, as I say. Moving on to the next one I read, which was In Flux, and again, this is by Tim Markitz, and this book is an urban fantasy. From the cover and from the description of urban fantasy, I panic slightly because urban fantasy is something I definitely struggle with. It's not just this book, like most things labelled urban or paranormal fantasy I don't tend to enjoy that much. I think the only series that has ever broken that mould for me was the Split World series by Emma Newman, and that feels very fantastical, so it kind of doesn't quite fall into urban. Urban fantasy is something I struggle with, and I knew that going into this book. And I hoped that it would maybe be something really surprising and kind of shrug off the stereotype that I have, but it didn't do that. It felt a very gritty and noirish book, quite thrillery. It wasn't for me. I don't really read much thriller stuff, and I don't really like gritty noir books. That's what I struggled with Jim Butcher's series, the Dresden File books, that it just feels a bit too grim and gritty, and I feel like this is the same. If you do like those sorts of books, maybe you'll enjoy it, but for me personally, it wasn't my cup of tea. It follows a person who is currently residing inside someone else's body, and I think he's kind of an alienish, mystical kind of creature because he can get inside other people's bodies. And I believe it's set in this world where there's like these militant beings who are kind of coming to Earth and invading, and our main character, who's inside the body of someone else, is observing his bosses to try and find out what's going on. It's a bit weird, if I'm honest. It definitely feels a bit strange to me to start a story that way, and I wasn't sure that I was ever given enough context to really understand it. Maybe again, as the book went on, you would have got more of that, but I read 35% of this one as well, and then DNF'd it, and it wasn't really making a huge amount of sense to me. It was feeling like it was quite disjointed in places. There wasn't a huge amount of explanation given for the reasoning, and it didn't flow that well. It felt like it was a book trying to do something that I wasn't a fan of anyway, and then it wasn't doing it that well, if that makes sense. It wasn't a bad book, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't my cup of tea, and I just knew that from when I got to 35%, it wasn't going to be for me, so I DNF'd that one as well. I didn't get any bad errors in the writing. I feel like the writing was solid, even though it wasn't a story I was enjoying. The writing didn't have any glaring typos or anything like that, and at most I think it would have only got maybe a 2 stars from me, so I just didn't think it was worth continuing with, for me personally. Moving on to the next one I DNF'd, this one is called Audrey of Farmington, and it's by M. Greg Rowe, and this one was actually the one that I DNF'd the earliest. I got to around 20% in this, and I just was not feeling this. It is a fantasy book. It's set in a world where we follow young Audrey of Farmington, and she is quite a simple peasant girl who lives with her mother and father, who are quite a greedy family. They kind of want a lot more for themselves than they currently have. Her father in particular is very, very greedy, and as the story opens we see Audrey, who has just been bitten by a crocodile, something that is not necessarily native to their lands and is quite rare, and she has been the only survivor of this attack. There's been 2 others who were killed, and she's very lucky to have survived because 4 strangers walked through her town at the time where she was being attacked, and they had magic, so they were able to heal her. But by the time she wakes up and she's better, these strangers have gone and she just hears all these stories about them. So what I liked about this was that it started off with a kind of interesting concept of like this attack happening and these mysterious strangers, and there was potential there for it to be quite an interesting story. But the problem I had with it very early on was that this feels like it's aimed at maybe YA or even children. It does not feel like an adult book. It's very simplistic in the writing style, and Audrey herself is an incredibly simple character. She does not know about anything in the wider world, which feels a bit unrealistic even as a peasant child or a peasant young woman. I don't feel like it was realistic, the way that she just didn't know anything. Everything in this world has to be explained to her, and when she meets people who are from further afield later in the story and she travels further away, everything has to be explained to her. The conversations she ends up having with family and friends feels quite forced, and it doesn't feel like it's a flowing conversation at all. It feels very forced, very strange, weird to me. It didn't feel like a natural conversation at all. It felt very, very odd. and the writing the whole way through just didn't feel developed. It felt very, very simple. It was definitely in need of a strong copy editor to go through and kind of check it all for sense, because it really didn't flow very well. And that was my biggest problem. And if a book is written in a way that just doesn't flow and doesn't really make that much sense, I just can't get into it. And I felt no connection to the main character at all, even when she's being attacked by these crocodiles and then she's going out and talking to her friends. I didn't feel like there was anything to make her likeable. She does some quite detestable things very early in the book as well. Just because she wants to escape her home, she goes and she tries to seduce this stranger, and it works, and it's all a bit messy after that, and it just didn't feel realistic. It felt really weird, and just it didn't work for me at all. It just felt very jarring. So that one was definitely going to be out quite early. It was not my personal favourite by any means. I couldn't get along with that one. So again, at most it would have got 2 stars, possibly it would have got less than that, I don't know. Moving on to books that I did finish, the first of those was Dragon's Trail. This book is written by Joseph Malik, and this is a book that I did finish because I had pretty high hopes about it. I personally don't read an awful lot of military heavy fantasy. I don't mind sword and sorcery, and I don't mind like adventures where people get in battles. That's totally fine. I just don't like it where the plot is overtaken by military stuff. And this book is one of those books where that is the case. So I wasn't aware of that going into it, despite the sword on the cover, as some people did very helpfully point out to me. I wasn't aware it was a hugely military read. So I went into it and it was quite interesting to begin with. It follows these 2 characters who come from Earth, and they are contacted by this person who can go between worlds and comes from a fairly stereotypical sort of medieval fantasy world, kind of your usual setting. This character comes into their world, says to these 2 new characters from Earth that they need help in a battle, and could these characters come into their world to basically help them train up their warriors and figure out how they're going to defeat this other enemy that they have in their world. So the 2 characters from Earth follow them through, and they go and they kind of become part of the civilization there. They have a fair amount of good banter at times. They're quite sort of self-deprecating and funny and witty and harsh and brash and all of that sort of stuff. But for me, it wasn't enough to overcome the huge amount of military stuff that goes on in this book, which is basically the entire plot, focusing on these 2 warriors who are training up other warriors and this war that is brewing. There's a lot of military stuff, and I don't personally have any connection to military. I don't really enjoy military stuff, and it didn't have enough other things going on for me personally. That's not to say it's a bad book. I don't think it is. I think it was written fine. I think the military stuff that's in there is fine. It just wasn't my cup of tea at all, and for that reason, I only gave it a 2 stars. It's an okay read, but nothing else for me personally was in the book. I did have some issues with this book, getting some negative feedback, and it was, I don't know, fans maybe of the book who were really angry that I'd given it a 2 stars. I don't think my review was unjust in any way. I think I was very fair with my review, and I'll link it for you guys to read if you want. Since then, the author wrote a post saying that he was amazed that anyone in the world can read fantasy and not enjoy fantasy that's hugely military. We're out there. I'm afraid we do exist, the people who don't love battle scenes in every page. So it just wasn't my cup of tea. But it's a nice thing that the author did at least point out that my review was fair, and the other people who were commenting seem to have gone, so that's good. It's all good. Tiny bit of drama, all done with. So yeah, in the end, I gave it 2 stars. I don't think it was my personal thing. I'm not saying it's not yours. If you enjoy those sorts of books, you may enjoy this one. Moving on to the book that won this round, and I'm afraid it got a fairly easy win, but I still think it's a very, very good book, and I really enjoyed it in its own right. And that is this one, which is Darkstorm by M.L. Spencer. I talked very briefly about this book in my wrap-up because I read it just before the end of August. I really, really enjoyed this book, and I was actually sent this book from the author as well. She offered me a physical edition alongside my digital one that I was sent as part of the SPFBO. So I'm really happy that I do have a physical edition because I really enjoyed this, and it was definitely well worth reading, and it's the one book of all of these that I would recommend you go and check out. So that's a plus. This book focuses on 2 brothers, and the 2 brothers are both mages, but they live in different parts of their worlds. One of them lives in this his other part as a kind of diplomat, and he has been there a couple of years now, and he's kind of trying to forge relations between his nation and the nation he's in. And the other one is a drunk who lives in his world. He's kind of just lounging through life, enjoying the small and crazy pleasures, and eventually the two of them kind of have to reunite. They haven't got on for many years, but they are forced back together. They're forced to work together because of some of the events that happen in this. One of them discovers there's this plot going on to unleash what essentially seems like a hell-spawn demon thing from another world, and it's going to terrorize and destroy all sorts of things for these people. So obviously they don't want this to happen, and there's pretty awesome battle mages in this. There's some pretty awesome general magic in this, really cool kind of concepts of the other world and these dark nefarious wizards coming together, and it had a lot of what I like. It was fast paced, it was fun, it got to the point quite quickly, but you still had the elements of world building and character growth, and it felt like it was a fun read the whole way through. And after reading 4 not so great books that I wasn't really enjoying and that I had issues with, this was exactly what I needed. But it definitely had depth to it and definitely had moments that were really good fun. And I think it's going to be a fun series because I know this is only the first book. I think there are 3 currently out. I definitely enjoyed this. I do think it's well worth trying and seeing if you like it, and I'll put a link to it on Amazon so you can find it there. My only criticism of this book is that I wish we'd had a few more like lead female characters, because obviously it does focus on the 2 male characters, and I think it would have been cooler to have a slightly longer book so that we could get a bit more world building in there too. But as it goes, the first book in a new series, it's definitely a series that I would continue with, and I do plan on picking up the second one at some point. Definitely the one I'd recommend out of the bunch. Let me know in the comments what you think of these 5 books. Are there any here that you would go and try? As I say, some of the ones that didn't work for me may well work for you if you like the things that I say I don't. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on all 5 of these in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will do an update again in a few weeks of the next 5. And fingers crossed they'll be a little bit better than this batch was for me, because this batch was not great. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you very soon in my next video. Bye guys!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.